Welcome to Unite Now, conversations at the crossroads of leadership and flourishing. As we as leaders seek to invest in our communities and invest in flourishing in our communities, we often get the opportunity to build relationships with people who are from different races, different social classes, different everything, right? And so a lot of our conversations are even just around like, how do we have these relationships in ways that promote flourishing and help us thrive? And so over the last couple of months, we have been focusing specifically on building relationships across class or social class. And again, for those of you who are joining us, you know, this is conversation style. We're just trying to, we're different people coming to the table, seeking to have a conversation, and we don't always agree. We know that you won't always agree with us, but we feel like learning and growth happens in the space of the conversation. And so with me today are my co-hosts, David Park, Tito Ruiz, Yvette Bratton, and then our special honored guest today is Jay Harris, and we're so excited to have Jay with us today. Hey, Jay. So anyways, okay, so let's just kick off this conversation. Let's just talk. So can you, Jay, first of all, just tell us a little bit, I mean, half of us on the screen don't even know. Tell us a little bit about who you are, a little about your background and context, and then we'll jump into some of the other parts of the conversation.
Yeah, most definitely. So yeah, thank y'all for having me also. I'm super excited to get to hang with y'all and stuff. So this is huge. So my name is Jay Harris. I'm a father, you know what I'm saying? I have 10 kids, and yeah, I said that's right. We got six girls, four boys. So if I start weeping during this thing, then it's just me thinking about, these kids driving me crazy or whatever. But anyway, they're a blessing. I love them to death or whatever. And raised them with my wife, Alana Harris, and so it's a beautiful thing. I'm a pastor here in Jacksonville, Florida. I was born in Newark, New Jersey, and I still, when I go up there, they say I sound, super Southern or whatever. But I've been in Florida so long that I feel like I'm a Jacksonvillian at this point or whatever in Jacksonville, Florida. Came to the Lord probably about 20 years ago, and just got rocked. Got pulled into a church. I was in the middle of planning to murder somebody on some revenge kind of stuff, and my little ego and pride got hurt, and felt somebody got had to get hit up like that or whatever, and stumbled in the church, and they started preaching, and I thought it was the weirdest thing I ever seen on earth or whatever. But then after a while, I got jealous because I'm like, who are they looking up at the sky at? Like, who they worshiping somebody? Like, I'm like, and they're smiling. And I hadn't smiled in so long. And long story short, after a couple months, even though I fought it with all my heart, God ended up just yanking me, and I was fighting him the whole way. So by his grace or whatever, that's how I kind of, landed before the cross and got dipped in the mercy and grace and all that good stuff. And but I still had a lot of cats, I ran with that were still in the street. And so I always had this thing where I wanted to share the gospel with them and try to figure that out and work out that tension and stuff. And so I feel like that's been kind of an ongoing journey in my life or whatever, is trying to, figure out how to reach people, you know what I'm saying? And particularly people I feel who are overlooked, in contexts that are overlooked. Oh, and I pastor a church in Jacksonville called the Ville Church. Yeah.
Yep, yep. And so when I first met you, you weren't a pastor. You were you had a store in downtown Jacksonville, and I'm just
Yeah.
would love for you to tell a little bit about the store, like what was going on there, why did you have it, and then what would that even have to do with, like, how did that impact or facilitate connecting in relationships with people from different social classes?
Yeah, definitely. So, when I came to the Lord, I was it happened in a church. I didn't know anything about churches at all. I didn't pick it. I started bringing in some of my friends that I ran with in the street, and I'm like, man, come to church. What really got me was I couldn't tolerate the way my friends were being looked at. The people were kind, they were acting Christian, but I could see there's a way that they looked at them, and I couldn't stand it for my friends. And that kind of led me. I started this clothing brand, but that kind of led me into the whole thing of like, yo, I'm gonna open a store, and I want to put it in the street, right in the middle of everything. And I chose downtown because, Jacksonville is just a very fractured city. They don't esteem really big events really well or whatever and stuff. They never do that really well. But we had this one thing called Art Walk that happened once a month downtown, and it's like sometimes 10,000, maybe 15,000 people. And so I put the store on the main strip right in the middle of it. And so what really, the thoughts I had in my mind was I wanted to see what happened when I'm like, it was a Christian brand or whatever, it's a streetwear brand, so it was cool and it was fly and all that, but like we still had a message. And my plan was, I'm like, I'm gonna make this. It was more of a ministry effort than it was a clothing, like or a business deal, because I knew the space was going to be horrible from an entrepreneurial standpoint. Like it just didn't have, the foot traffic and the clientele that I was looking for to support it. But it still put me in the thick of a lot of brokenness. And so me and my wife were like, hey, we're doing good online. Let's support this. Let's do a 4-year lease and see how this thing actually plays out, and we'll pay for it. But our real motive is really the gospel, and to really do this experiment where we're like, what happens when we just fall in the middle of all of the madness? And it my first experience with it was straight off the bat, it knocked the religiousness out of me. Anybody would have been like, yo, Jay is cool, man. Jay, what's popping in the street, everybody and everything and all of that stuff, complete crap or whatever. When I knew how to dip out of kind of the church context and still go back and visit, but I had lost something sitting in a building for a decade or whatever and stuff. And sitting and I found myself in the dressing room on the floor praying all the time because I was dealing with homelessness and brokenness and people coming in the doors constantly. And my little church game rhetoric wasn't playing the trick anymore. I found out that my mercy and my love was really, really shallow. So it was a very humiliating experience in a very good way that really drove me to my knees. Thank God. And in that time in that store changed me tremendously. Like it made me a completely different person. And so yeah, so that was my journey. That's how I actually ended up opening the store. And so it was I don't got a good word or whatever. I'll just say it was thugalicious for lack of words or whatever. Like it was just the store was popping. Like, number one, there weren't any African American owners like barely downtown at all, right? So we on a strip in a really prominent building and the build out on the space, like we killed it. And so now you got a mob of cats just smoking Black and Miles, gold teeth in front of the store. The business people were feeling all kind of ways about it or whatever and stuff. And but it was amazing or whatever. And over time, we really won. A lot of the business people were just on our side because my tactic was, I know this feels out of place. Let's serve everybody. So we go to the business owners and like, oh man, I see your girls put up the table at 6 o'clock when y'all close. Like we're gonna get y'all's tables for you. Or like they had people that's like a bookstore and people were carrying in their books to sell them. We're like, yo, get their boxes. Like it became a tactic where we just won a crazy amount of favor and built relationships with people, and just one of the most amazing experiences and seasons in my life. It was huge for us. It was huge for us, and that eventually ended up transitioning into me. Oh yeah, so when I had the store, one of the things I did. One of my tactics was we chilled and we hung out, and I mean, I'm talking about we'd be playing ball in the street at 3, 4 a.m. or whatever. But we did a Bible study every single Wednesday, and that Bible study went from like 4 people to the point like people would be holding the door like because they couldn't fit in the room. And I mean, the Bible studies were lit. I mean, we have everybody in there. You have Hebrew Israelites, everybody debates, brawls would almost break out. Um, like it used to get crazy, but people loved it. Like some people would come and they'd be like, "This is the craziest thing I've ever been a part of," and they're like, "I thought I was going to get in a fight." I'm like, "But did you love it?" They're like, "I did. I loved it." I was like, "Did you hear the gospel?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "These people ain't, it ain't your grandma's church." I said, "This is all cats straight out the street or whatever." And they're bolsterous when they share what they share, whatever. But I always just led us back to the word and walk through it, and people would be like, "Oh, that's what it's saying." I'm like, "Homie, this is what it is. We got to deal with this thing or whatever." And it's such an honest, just a really real kind of conversation. And I, by no means that like even people of influence in the community showed up. Like, and that was I didn't expect that. I didn't expect that the draw would eventually like pull people that had power. They were in bands in the city and doing a lot of shows, and people who, like news anchors and everything. They started hearing about it, so they started showing up. It had this crazy draw because it was just so raw and so real. And one of the statements, a lot of people that came, even friends I still have to this day, they were like they would tell me, they were like, "There's no way in the world I ain't coming near no church, period." They're like, "I go to Bible study in your store though." And next thing you know, we'd be baptizing them. And so it really was, it made this space where people like, I'm comfortable here. Like I can't get to the church, but I can get in this room with you. And so it was an amazing thing. Straight and Narrow Boutique, that was the name of it.
Why do you think people were comfortable there when they wouldn't feel comfortable in a church?
I think the church, and I think we all know this, it comes with baggage, and it has this, and we walk around with kind of an assumed credibility with it or whatever. And so when we meet people, we kind of almost like lord it over them or kind of posture ourselves kind of high over them. And we don't know anything about them. We don't know their story. We have esteem for God, so sometimes we think we can just shout and command or like push people into some kind of relationship that's us standing over them and everything else or whatever, and kind of dictate them the way the relationship is going to go. But that's not real, and people I think are really sick and tired of that. And they also usually walk into cultures in church that they have to assimilate into it to exist. So they never get to be themselves. Like they feel like they have to put a mask on. And I think in my store, like one of my like what how I got content for what to preach and talk about was sitting and chilling with everybody all week. So Cass would talk about, stuff that was going on with the girls they were dating or whatever and stuff, the drugs they were dealing with, everything else. I would hear all of these things, and I would just let them speak, and I didn't try to correct, I didn't try to fix anything with anybody, but then it would find itself inside of my sermon later on, and whatnot. And so I think people are just comfortable. They in churches, it's hard for people to find that in the middle of the cultures we usually find in churches these days.
Okay, Jay, there is something really powerful in what you just said about when people go to church. They when you brought your friends to church, they sensed that the attitude of the people inside the church was, "You're welcome, but I'm gonna fix you." That really struck a nerve in my heart, because as a pastor, that's the last thing I want us to have, a condescending attitude to people who come to our worship services, because it takes a lot of energy for someone to show up to at a church service for the first time, and to encounter that level of reception is just sad. So my question to you is, I see different layers of judgment. One is you're rejected. People look bad at you. But there's a subtle one where you are welcome, but it has a mask on of "you're welcome, but I'm going to fix you." What do you think needs to happen in the church so that doesn't continue?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a great question, Tito. So there's a couple of things come to my mind. One, I think that we deal with an issue of like what it looks like to actually be genuine and real with people, right? So like I think what has happened in the space of the church is that we've learned this kind of robotic kind of kindness and everything else, and it looks good on the outside or whatever, but it's usually shallow, and so it doesn't go deep enough to make real connections with people. It's like we may have the welcome team and they know how to be excited and they know how to, like celebrate people as they come in, but maybe not always know how to actually connect beyond that. And I think a lot of people actually pick up on that stuff. So I think there's definitely a conversation that needs, that needs to happen about that. And then I think there's also, just cultural differences that, that we need to make ourselves low in relationships, right? Like, esteem others higher than ourselves, even when we don't know them and we're greeting them or whatever, because there's things we don't know about them, right? There's things that they've experienced, in life that we may not get it all, right? My sister was telling me about a friend she finally got to go to church, and the kid comes in and they greet him, and the first thing they do at the door is they tell him he has to take his hat off. They didn't know that the kid had alopecia and he had bald spots all over his head or whatever. And so when he went in the church, sat through it, was humiliated. Of course, he didn't hear anything at all, but like he said, I'll never ever go inside of a church ever again. And so that's kind of a heightened example, but I think stuff like that kind of happens with people all the time. That we're not catching whatever when we're actually meeting and greeting people and everything else. And so I think I think I think the power of listening is extremely important when we meet people, because once again, we start running our play on making them feel invited, but like we're turning them into a project, and I feel like that has become a cultural thing that we do inside of the church or whatever, and so there's not a lot of listening ears and actually even interest. Sometimes it's like we're going to on ramp you into this thing, and not that on ramping them into our church or assimilating them into things or whatever is wrong at all. We need those processes in place as well. But I think sometimes we put the cart before the horse when we're not seeking to have a genuine connection or whatever. And so I think that's a dynamic that is really it's worth making it our staff, or just even as believers individually, like making this a very esteemable thing, that we carry with us into our relationships, into our meetings with people, and learning how to practice it and do it. No, none of us are perfect at it at all, and we won't hit the ball out of the park every time. But I think culturally does need to be something that's really esteemed for us to connect with people well, and make dynamic connections, right off the bat. Sometimes it's the only chance we get.
And I feel that we're so far behind, and as a church, um, it is incredible how we are preaching about love, 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 and that is at some points is the last thing that we're doing, when it should be the very first thing that we should do. Is just simply love, right? Whoever comes through
Yep.
our doors, just
Yeah.
love. Don't study them, don't examine them, don't observe them, see them, which is a different, it's totally different. I'm not examining you, I see you, and I want to get to know you, and I love the fact that you're here, not the other way around.
I was thinking there's a couple of things that I was
Yeah.
thinking of, Jay, that I feel like could be like some like key things. Like when you're in that store environment, the majority, so like the majority of the group were people. It was you, right? You were leading, but then the majority of the group were people who
Mm.
were just not in the church, right? So there was a feeling in the
Yeah.
environment, like, hey, this is cool. I'm cool here, because the feeling, like, so I wonder how much that is impacted. Just like, hey, when I go into a church and there's all these ways of doing things, there's all these sort of rules of how things get done, and like that doesn't feel like home, right? That doesn't feel like, hey, this is my space. This feels like I'm walking into a completely foreign space, right? So I wonder I wonder about that. And then the other thing that you mentioned, or something that you mentioned that I was just thinking about, is the fact that, like, this fixing mentality, right? And I wonder how different it would be.
Hmm.
It's like we come as like, hey, welcome here, welcome, welcome. But there's this sense of like, am I willing to be transparent and honest and show up as like a broken person, not as the person who's like the holy person who's discipling. Like, I personally have found like my mentality as an evangelical, with this idea of like I'm supposed to make disciples, has sort of gotten twisted in my head of like I'm sort of holy and have all the answers, and then when I engage with people who don't know Jesus, then I'm the purveyor of all truth and they're the receiver of all from me, right? And I just wonder how much that has played unintentionally into those relationship dynamics. So I know that's a couple of different directions, but just curious how you'd respond to either of those things.
Yeah, first of all, yeah, I wish y'all had like some kind of bomb cue or something, like a DJ. You could just like hit the button and start making some bombs go off the roof. I think you just hit it dead on the head or whatever. I'm gonna speak to the first part, what you were saying or whatever. But you know, when I was at the store, and I make this statement all the time, I had to actually kick out more. Um, Christians than I did anybody else. And the reason I did is because, first of all, when people found out that I was a believer, they were like, oh, okay, yo, you got this space. Like, this is our clubhouse. Okay, so we're going to roll up on it. They would try to stand out and evangelize in front of the store. They would turn all of the guys that hung in front of the store, or whatever, because, we have a homeless population downtown. Sometimes they would sleep in my store at night. Sometimes they would sleep in the basement. They found a family at the store. We treated them with esteem. When we ordered food for everybody, we fed everybody outside, anybody. So they knew if they were like, we don't have shoes, they knew they could come get shoes. When the good old Christian folks showed up, right? They showed up, and the first thing they started doing was like, "Oh man, yo, like I remember one day this dude was like, yo, Jay, man, the homies in front of your store smoking a black and mild." And I was like, so he's like, you want me to get rid of him? And I'm like, first of all, you think you have some kind of assumed rank where you think you're more my friend than that person or whatever and stuff, whatever, right? I'm like, I said, and this is what I told him. I said, homie outside of the store is waiting for Bible study. And he's a real killer in real life. Would you like to tell him to put out his black and mild, have him leave the store and get back to doing what he does in the streets? Or would you like to let him enjoy his black and mild and come into this Bible study and hear the word? You know what I'm saying? So like, and even when I talk about, like my first experience inside the store and how it had to smack the religiousness out of me, it was that kind of foolishness of what I thought, people were supposed to be a project. And I got my little religious heart broken or whatever. Thank God he did this for me. It was a blessing from God, but um, I had to contend with that for often, and and it got to the point that um, you end up bearing the reproach of the people you hang with. And so for a lot of people, I think in the Christian context of our city, they kind of looked at me like, man, we don't know what's up with him. We kind of roll with a crazy little crew. And I loved it because I wanted them to stay away from me, because I felt like the work that God had me doing and with the kind of people he had me doing with was valuable. And when I say the kind of people, they were my friends, right? Like I begin to grow and love them, and I begin to become challenged from moving them out of these certain boxes, because it's like, yeah, he has nowhere to sleep. And am I doing a Christian project with him, or is he actually my friend? Because if he's my friend, then I'm going to respond. And I grew out of this space of making people a project to like just being in their life and them being my friend and responding to them like I would any friend. And that relationship opened so many opportunities for me to preach the gospel to people in a very real way and in a practical way with what they were living, right? Whether it was their relationships with their kids, their girlfriend, what they were going through, whether they feel like they were being, injustice or anything like that. I got to jump right in it. And being a believer, my answers were usually gospel answers, or the way we should handle it, or I could point them to the word, like this is the way we need to go about this, and this is why I'm saying this. So it's for me, it's the most robust time of actual, discipleship that I ever had. But it looked nothing like the discipleship that you were referring to earlier, where, yeah, when I came in, they were a project, and I think we have got that backwards. Like what I've realized as a pastor over time, and I'm 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 honestly bewildered, like at this point in my life, and I'm just trying to figure out some things, and even going through preparing for this meeting and the questions I began to ask myself, they're so life giving to even revisit that space and talk about it. Um, because I jumped into the church and some of the gangster gets knocked out of you or whatever, right? And you're in this contained space. But I realized God was sanctifying me and growing me when I was out in the wild in a very amazing way or whatever. And I still got some of the wild stuff in me. But like it's a different game inside of the church or whatever. And like this idea of like the way we go about discipling people, I think is problematic in a lot of ways, because I think you're dead on. It makes people a project, and it's not about relationship. And to be honest with you, I found out that I'm not even good at actually doing it that way. I know how to roll with people in the street and walk through them in life or whatever. And that's actually been the most effective way that that I've seen fruit, to be honest.
I wanted to ask if the fact that you had a store made shaped the relationships sort of on a different pretense, so that the church sometimes has a different pretense, right? The shape of the church and the fact that you enter into a church, sometimes presumes that there's a need that needs to be met. That when you walk through those doors, you're already acknowledging, hey, I need something. I'm a sinner. I'm in need of grace. So already, just by entering in, sometimes it can feel like the individual walking in has a disadvantage. Whereas at a store, walking into a store means, hey, I'm a customer, and the customer is always right. You know what I mean? Like there is a sense that I am somebody, because I may have a need, but I got money, and so we can exchange stuff right away. So it's like the shape of the dialogue changes because it's just a different relationship walking into the store. Do you think that maybe the store has that advantage to a church per se, just because of the way people see themselves differently by walking in?
Yeah, most definitely, David. I think you're dead on. The relationships I have out of that store are still, I mean, like I just a guy that I met in the store all those years ago. I just bailed him out of jail this week for the second time, right? You know what I'm saying? It's in our relationship, but he's my man. Like when he hits a wall, he's gonna call me or whatever, right? He's, he has issues and he's bipolar and all of this stuff, and he's halfway in the street and everything else, but he's still at my dinner table. Like, a decade later, he's still at the table. He's still gonna pop up in the church every now and then. I have access to speak into his life or whatever and stuff. Like I have relationships with his mom, and we jointly are trying to like help him and be there for him. But like I've never had to ban a person out of the church ever in my life and be like, yo, you can't come back. He did something that was so crazy he couldn't come back. We still have a robust relationship. Like it was, and people probably like, what do you mean? I'm like, it was like he threatened somebody in a way where, like, for the safety of people, I had to not let him actually be able to come in there, whatever, for their safety. But like, it's still never shipwrecked our relationship. Another guy from the store was just here last week, at my house with his son, and he was like, "Yo, Jay, can you lay hands and pray for me or whatever?" They've been all over the map, like with messiness, sin, issues, and everything else. But that's not what they are to me. They're just my friends, and that the store really fostered that dynamic because they were able to just come as they are, and they were able to go as slow as they needed to go. And my cat just climbed up on there or whatever. So anyway, that should make for exciting footage. But yeah, so they were able to grow at a pace that was very realistic. And I do think that the dynamic inside of our churches are they're not always the most it's not always the effective way. God's going to move regardless, for sure. But I think in this season, especially in this day and age with what we have going on in the world, there's some things or whatever that I believe God is pressing on us to reshape. I think we've been so holding so fast to tradition, and some of these traditions simply don't have any. They're not locked. Like we don't have to betray the gospel, but some of the framework that we function and we think church is, I think we need to crush some of these things and rebuild these spaces so they can be more conducive to people growing, building relationships, and God being glorified in the midst of those things, whatever. And I think for a lot of people, the organization or the business of the church has, not to just throw disdain. I don't think all churches are about that or whatever, but some people haven't been inclined to look at what's wrong with it because in their context, it still works, right? But we have different needs inside of urban context and with, different social classes. And the more fluent church sometimes is like, oh, no, that's a sin to try to innovate what this space is and everything else. So you're not really doing church. And they've tried to big brother us like that. And I'm like, nah, like in this season, we need to be breaking all the chains off. And we need to be moving forward with loving people, making relationships, holding fast to the gospel like never before, because that's our source or whatever. So that's never something that, we can bend or twist or do anything with. But I think God is definitely pushing us towards, innovating and dreaming in a way that we know is loving to our neighbors and beneficial for them.
Jay, I have a question because a lot of our audience are pastors and in different contexts. And I heard you say that people need to go as low as they need to go. That was just a mic drop moment that we just need to, meditate on that. Then Yvette said, when we enter into relationship, that was brilliant. We must have relationship in mind, not fixing. So my question for the pastors in the audience is, what is our role then? Because I think we're maybe not discovering, but emphasizing that there's a discipleship problem going on, because some churches are training or equipping or discipling their people to love at all costs, others to bring salvation, others for life transformation. And I think that's when we're seeing this tension. So if we're going to go as low as the people need to go, if we're going to enter into a relationship with relationship in mind, what is our role then? What word would you have to the pastors in the audience that have been maybe discipling on one lane, and they're discovering that there's another one that they're completely missing?
I'm gonna answer this, and I hope people can grab my heart when I say it. I think that one of our roles is to um, stand next to people and look at Jesus, right? Like, we don't stand over them. We don't preach to them and tell them what we got right and how we're knocking it out of the park. I think we model this need for Jesus, right? You know what I'm saying? Like, we don't model that like we got it all together. We're not like the Pharisee or whatever in the temple, whatever, with the tax collector who beats on his chest and runs off his resume and says, "Thank God I'm not like these other people over here." And there is this very there's this magnetic thing that can happen when you, but depend on your context as far as what a pastor is supposed to be. And it might be this thing where you get this kind of moral platform that you're good and it affords you power and everything else. And I think pastors that have kind of drank from that cup, I think you have to resist it. I think you have to repent from it, because I think what Jesus calls us to be is foot washers, right? And he's like, that's what it is, or whatever. We're called to wash some feet up in here. And he esteems even the wretch and the tax collector that beats on their chest and says, "God, have mercy on me, I'm a sinner." And I think that statement is true of every single human on this earth, despite what their role is, and so forth. Even in Hebrews 5, it talks about how the high priest, it says that he understands the wayward and the brokenness of the people, because he himself, when he mediates for the people and gives a sacrifice for the sins, first he has to sacrifice for his own sins. So he's able to look at people and have this empathy. And then it talks about Christ, how Christ, when he was in his flesh, he was actually praying and going to the Father, it says, with a reverence that, this is Jesus, right? He is like praying to Daddy, you know what I'm saying, with this reverence, like, "Lord, help me." And it says that he fought every single thing, all the temptations. And he says, "Because I did, I'm able to empathize with you. Go dive into the throne of grace." Like, don't run and hide in your sin, but go dive in it. I think it's important for us as believers, specifically ministers, because I think we preach out of the fruit and goodness of that very thing that we're talking about, um, to never forget that and hold on to it for dear life, because things get real weird and strange when we miss that. And so relationally, for pastors, what I would tell them is, like, number one, hold that close, because it's humbling. Also, I would say esteem the work of loving people that are not like you, that walk, talk, move, have different experiences like you, because if you're holding on to the gospel and you step into these relationships, you will be humbled, number one. But if you hold on to Christ and you're able to be repentant, you're able to see your faults, you're able to see your sin, you're able to see when you miss it. If you're able to even declare to the person you're dealing with, like, "Hey, you know what? Forgive me, because, you know, I'm not aware of certain things, and like you're teaching me things and everything else, then God is going to use those instances to sanctify us or whatever. You know, we always like talk about going to save the hood. I'm like, no, the hood is actually going to sanctify the church as we have proximity or whatever. Like there's gold in the streets or whatever that the church actually needs, and the church doesn't do well when it, you know, like gets stuck in these kind of class games or whatever, and you know, throws its pinky up like it's better than everybody else. It misses an opportunity to bear the fruit that God meant for us to bear in the middle of these frictions. And so I would say for pastors to reject anything that doesn't look like that, because I think the wellness of our churches are at stake or whatever. If we neglect that kind of work, we turn into something really, really weird that doesn't look like the Jesus we see hanging out with, you know, tax collectors and everybody that people think he shouldn't be with or whatever, right? Like that stuff is good for us.
So you were in a store, you're a pastor now, you're leading a church. Um, and just so that, first of all, just so pastors don't feel like they're like weighted under the like weight of failure. Can you talk about how like you feel like it's going for you in your own church as you're trying to lead your people through this kind of thing?
Yeah, yeah. Um, it it has it's been a devastating journey, and it almost feels like sometimes, you know, I'm just going to be transparent with it. Sometimes it feels like Groundhog Day, and the reason I say that is because you seem to have these epiphanies where you're like, you know, like what we're talking about right now, you learn a few things and you're like, you know, I need to tighten it up a little bit. And so you tighten up a little bit. You're more direct in your sermons, right? You speak and you lead with more clarity on the issue. And what I've experienced, especially because my church has, you know, at a certain point, it was probably 50-50, you know, black and white, whatever. And then, you know, and then as I'm preaching and I'm talking about justice, I'm talking about race issues, I'm talking about, you know, class stuff or whatever, I see people running out of the room, right? Like I've had the conversations of people leaving so much as we've spoke about issues pertaining to race and justice and everything else, that I usually, because I got somewhere to go, I'm like, hey, hold on, and I'll just finish the person's speech, and they're like, yeah, exactly. You understand? I'm like, no, I don't understand, but I just know what you're gonna say. Hey, I love you or whatever, right? And so, you know, so it feels like Groundhog Day sometimes, like trying to um, do this work, because for my church, I pretty much inherited a church that was planted by somebody else. So all of that, the dynamics in the room were already set up before I got there. And so I feel like I've been in this long journey of undoing. And I've done the work with hope. I preach the gospel with hope. I preach the gospel with hope for diversity and for closeness and real relationships. And that hasn't always been the case at all. You know, I had somebody leave the church, and like, you know, the neighborhood we're in, Brentwood, Ruth used to work in this neighborhood and served it tremendously. The work that she did is still remains there through Second Mile, a nonprofit that's there. But I remember I had this, it was a group of four girls or whatever, and they said, hey, we're leaving the church. And I said, well, why are you leaving? They're like, we're leaving because you've had we feel you have an idolatry towards this community. And I said to them, I said, I've done two events in the community in the past year, and you've never been to neither one of them. And I'm like, I could receive what you're saying if you were coming to say that I have some other kind of idolatry that's keeping me from going knee deep into the community. But I'm like, we've we've barely been in the community, right? And so stuff like that has been disheartening, right? Like, you know, stuff like that has been heartbreaking because, you know, I do this work with my heart. I love those people, right? But like, there's not even room for conversation to work through it anymore. And so I feel like sometimes there's this thing where I'm like, you're trying to tighten the belt. So you also, so, you know, and you don't want to think about church like this, but you begin to think that you have to think this way to protect the people who are actually, indigenous, right? Like in the context or whatever, but you almost have to have stumbling blocks for people that try to enter in the space and really aren't about being in the space for real. You know, when I would do my membership classes with even some of my white members, what I would say to them, and I meant this in the most loving way, I would say, hey, some of you have never had a black leader in your entire life. You've never had a black leader at work. You've never maybe even had a black teacher. And I need you to digest real quick before you say that you want to actually be a part of this church and do the work that we actually feel we're called to. I need to you to digest and work through some of those dynamics. Like and you're in a safe space where you can actually come to me and talk to me about it. My feelings are not going to be hurt. Like, I'm here to help you and serve you, even if you find yourself on the very ugly side of this conversation. But it doesn't help us if you're not honest about it. And so the work has been really, really hard. So the work has looked like that. The flip side of that is I got young boys dying left and right all around me, people who are really, really suffering. And I found myself in a grievous conflict where I'm having these kind of conversations where I'm serving people who are blind to the work that we're doing, but they're content with consuming the time that I'm like, this person's house is literally on fire. Or, you know what I'm saying? Or, there's been times when I've seen, you know, there's been times that I've had kids that, they went away for 25 years and my heart was broke over it. And my first thought was, my God, I used to sit with this kid. I used to go have lunch with them. When did I stop having lunch? What did I replace the time with? Because I had his ear at a certain point. And then while something else took my time, the streets swallowed them whole. And usually when I go back and go through it, I'm not happy with what took my time at all. And so that's been a grievous weight to carry. So I find myself really deconstructing some things inside of the church right now, and it probably looks very weird to people. I'm talking to my leaders really heavy as I go through this stuff. I'm talking to a counselor as I go through this stuff because I love the Lord, not because I'm hyper religious. I love him because I have nowhere else to go, right? Like the old thug I told you about that's about to kill somebody, like, yo, he waiting right around the corner. As soon as Jesus gone, he like, I'm on you, my G. Like, I don't know how to be no other person but that guy. The only fruit I got is what Jesus is doing in my like. I don't know how in the world I've been married for 20 years. It's a miracle still, right? And so I don't got nowhere. So I'm not going to do something else that doesn't have Jesus in it. But I most definitely am wrestling with how this work is actually going to look. And I'm definitely some of the things that, I once held to and felt I needed to protect structurally with the church. I'm looking at it and I'm like, it's not fruitful for this place that I'm in. And I'm even stepping away from some of the organizational relationships I've had. And it's not because I dislike the people or don't love them. I'm just like, what you're doing works for your context. You should continue on doing it that way. In my context, it doesn't produce any fruit. And I'm losing time with somebody who may end up in jail next week while I'm sitting inside of meetings with somebody who's not concentrating on this thing. Like, we need answers and we need them now. Like, and so that's what it's looked like for me to wrestle through a lot of this stuff lately.
What things are you thinking about changing as far as engagement? And then what kinds of, even if a person can't do it exactly like you're doing it, because that may not, like, that might be too much of a jump, right? But are there transferable principles or ideas that you think of that, like, hey, these are the key things that make sense as far as really as a church getting out into the world and getting out into community in ways that can promote flourishing?
Like I said, I'm in a whirlwind right now with thoughts or whatever. So I'm just going to throw some of the stuff that's been swirling around my head. Um, when I had the store, or whatever, like, and I ended up, taking a position as a pastor with a church that was literally up the street from the store. When the pastor left the church probably 3 years ago, and Ruth, I'm gonna call her a prophet because we met with her, right? And so we were doing this thing, I'm pastor, it's a white pastor, me or whatever, and we meet with Ruth, and Ruth tells us, she's like, yeah, y'all probably got a 3 year run or whatever and stuff before like things kind of, what I'm saying, go their way or whatever. And I was like, nah, I rebuked that one or whatever. And literally almost on the 3 year mark, my man steps away out the situation or whatever and stuff, and that's how I became lead pastor inside of the church or whatever. But one of the things he said when he left was, he said, Jay, if I could go back and do things differently, I never would have come inside of your church and said, like, I thought that you were supposed to come, be a part of this church plan or anything like that. Number one, he apologized. He said, actually, it was really racist because I never would have went inside of a white guy's store who had that much influence inside of the community and talked about them coming to join my thing, right? And then he said, what I would have done is he said, I would have got behind you and I would have served you in what you were doing. And I make that statement because I think I think, I ended up in a framework of people that didn't esteem the value of what the store was. So they never encouraged me in it. I didn't know anything about running a church at that time. I had no esteem to be a pastor. And I wouldn't change this journey by any means because it's given me more esteem and a robust love for like the Lord than ever. And so even with all the pain that's come with it, I wouldn't backtrack it and change the story. But nevertheless, I have a clarity about the dynamics of the store and how they teach us in this moment, right? And how valuable that time was. And so I think what I thought was I was going to go inside of a church and what was happening in the store was now going to happen out of the church, right? And it just simply hasn't been the case. Looking back at it, um, it the space mattered. And I think coming into this, becoming a pastor and accepting some of the ideas about it and like, hey, everything is focused around the sermon. And, and sometimes our self-righteous kind of mantras or whatever are like, hey, we just gonna preach the word or whatever. And we don't always look at all of the other dynamics associated, that affect the things around us or whatever, and especially the culture of the communities we find ourselves in. Like the model has been you set up in a building and then people come inside of the building. We're now in a time when, especially inside of communities of color, there seems to be like at least we know where we're at, there's a huge disdain for the church. There's so much content that is pushing against the church. And some of the disdain that people have, we've earned it or whatever, and churches still aren't able to be honest about where we've misstepped. We preach repentance, but we actually don't do it. And therefore, we're losing credibility even faster because we won't say, hey, we did this wrong. Or like, we bought into something that was really like, it's not even the gospel we preach. Even when I'm talking to people one-on-one, one of the ways I always end up building credibility because they start criticizing the church. And I'm like, yeah, homie, I feel you. They're like, yo, you the pastor though. I'm like, yeah, but like we're called to repent. And what you're saying is the truth. I say, actually, you sound like you need to be leading the church. Really? You know what I'm saying? Like, and they're like, oh, okay. I'm like, yeah. I'm like, you think your grief makes you at odds with the church, but actually it could be God. This could be that you actually see clearer than some of the people who call themselves, leaders in the church. And so for me, kind of just curving back to the question, I think there's no way in the world I can do this. I feel like and I just spoke to my eldership about this. I said, if we do not land in the space that connects with the community face to face, I don't, I don't know if I can posture in a building for like, if I'll last very long. It just simply doesn't work for me at all. Um, the other option is not that I won't be preaching the gospel, but I'll just be going to the park or wherever it is. Like I always was preaching the gospel in the street, right? There is this, when you look at the story of the Pharisee in the temple with the tax collector, there's this thing where the Pharisee is up front in the temple and he's running off his resume before God, but the tax collector won't even draw near. And he's beating on his chest and he's saying, God, please have mercy on me. He knows what he is, but the sanctified holy people are up in the church, the Pharisees up there. So he finds himself on the outskirts. And I wonder often, if there's so many people whose hearts are very close to God, but they won't come near the building because of what we've kind of modeled in front of them or the way we've um, become a boast culture in our self-righteousness, the way we set class like this right here, whatever, and culturally we move here, we move at this, like I won't follow pastor unless his car looks like this and he moves like this, and all of these foolish things that have nothing to really do with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And there's people on the outside and they're fully aware. They look like wretches to self-righteous or us self-righteous folks, but really they're out there beating on their chest like, Lord, please have mercy on me. I don't think it's acceptable for those who are called to context like that, right? That has that tax collector that is in that story, to have a space that does not cause proximity with them. I think having cold buildings that they can go by, but don't have, have the front porch in the backyard where they can't see you more, instead of on the front porch where you can sit and have coffee and talk and congregate. I don't think that's acceptable at all anymore. And so I think for me, I think I misunderstood how, even with my experience with the store, I should have known better, but becoming more church cultured, I didn't esteem how important that space was and how much of a catalyst it was for the gospel for sure. And I saw more people come to Christ in that store than I have as a pastor for sure. Um, and so forth. That store needed some, I didn't have the esteem for the church when I was in that store. I needed that. And I needed what I've learned in the church or whatever, but like, I most definitely can't, be nonchalant with what I learned in the store. But, drill in on the question, Rube, the space is something that is of every, when I go through a lot of problems, I end up back at the way the space is used. And another thing too, the store edited out a lot of the people that were problematic that the church doesn't edit out. Um, it was a stumbling block for people. Like I said, I had to send Christians packing quite often. Or we became a reproach because of the people that were around. So a lot of them made the decisions themselves and they wouldn't come near us. And that was actually beneficial for the work. I mean, that's not what I hope for their heart, but it allowed us to do the work and be fully concentrated on the people and have the kind of culture that was functionally best for winning people, the way we were, whatever, right? I didn't have people who were like, oh, you're letting somebody homeless stay inside of the store, that couch is really, like, I don't care about the couch. You know what I'm saying? Like, this guy eats with us now. Like, right? Like God has called him to be our responsibility. Like he is our brother now. She's our sister now. We don't nonchalantly will see them walk up the street and not feed them anymore. We learned that from being close, and the space is what helped facilitate that and do that. And like, there's nothing wrong with taking trips into communities to do work, but like, it was more of a field trip. It was a lifestyle. We lived in it. It was church, right? And the gospel didn't get tucked in somewhere and take a back seat, and we didn't start getting squirrely with it and justice became the thing that overtook it. No, we preached the gospel with more clarity and more fire than we ever did. And because we esteemed the space and how it was going to affect the community, that provided a very robust experience, for the gospel to travel on. And so I think that's extremely big. And so, for other pastors, I would say like, you need to really, you need to listen to your community. Like, you need to listen to what people are saying. It's not that we bend the gospel or we get weird because people don't track with us, because some people just simply won't. But you have to hear the voice of the streets. But by no means, our job is not to defend the church and try to romanticize what it is and what it isn't. We're pointing people to the same Jesus we serve. And he says, yeah, Lord, I've sucked at times as a pastor, and want to repent of it. And I don't have a problem saying that in front of my church. I'm like, I ain't preach a gospel to you that told you I got to be perfect. You know what I'm saying? And so, but I did preach one about repentance and walking in the light, and I've missed it, And so I think we need to live like that, outwardly in the streets like that. I think that draws people, to the Lord. And so this work has caused me to inherit like very unlikely people that I love to death, and like they're really real friends or whatever. And it's not based off of because we walk, talk, and look the same, or whatever. They're just beautiful and teach me so much. And so I feel really rich with that. feel really rich when that happens.
Like this conversation has been really rich, and there's so much to sort of sit with, from what do our relationships look like, what absorbs our time, are we willing to hear and repent? Gosh, I feel like we could just keep going and going and going. And so thanks for taking time with us. I know your time is precious, and that you just love investing in relationship with so many people. So thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me, y'all.
Thanks for those of you who joined us in this conversation. I know there was a lot to chew on. I hope it provides some really good substance for you to just process with the Lord, and maybe with people inside your own faith community. Until next time.